distinct pleasure to be here to talk to you about the financial advice industry and about how it's responding to changes in the needs of Canadians. I actually do find it particularly fitting to be talking to you, independent financial brokers, because you're on the front lines. You are meeting the financial needs of your clients. And I suspect that every single day you will see many of the trends and themes that I'm going to be talking about over the course of the next few minutes. But I'm going to bring a slightly different take on it, and that's the take of a regulator. Now, many of you already know IROC. We're the Pan-Canadian Self-Regulatory Organization, which oversees investment dealers, and importantly, all of the trading activity on Canada's debt and equity markets. In turn, we're overseen by the 13 provincial and territorial securities commissions, collectively known as the CSA. And we're governed by what are called recognition orders, that is the document that gives us our powers. That makes us unique because in a country with provincial jurisdiction for securities regulation, we're a pan-Canadian entity. Now, effective regulation supports the growth in our capital markets and the health of the industry. And in my view, it is good for the economy overall because it boosts investor confidence. But regulation can't be static. And it can't be a barrier to change and innovation. And sometimes it is. The demographic and behavioral changes happening amongst Canadian investors were well documented in a report that we published earlier this year with the global consulting firm Accenture. As mentioned, it's on our website, and I encourage you to download it and take a couple of minutes to read through it. It was called Enabling the Evolution of Advice in Canada, and it was the result of an extensive consultation with industry leaders across the country. What we found was an industry in the midst of transformation, as clients seek new ways to consume financial advice, financial products, and services, along with the flexibility to do so in the way that they choose. And that's really the heart of what I want to talk to you about today. It also confirmed to us that we needed to more deeply understand what investors across Canada want and what they need, because they're the ones who are ultimately driving the industry to change. And if we, IROC, are supposed to support industry transformation through effective regulation, and ultimately to support Canadian investors, then we have to transform ourselves as well. And that's the sentiment which is at the heart of IROC's strategy. Evolving us as an organization so that our regulation responds to and supports a changing industry, one which is itself adapting to the changing needs of Canadians. So today, as I mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about what we learned with Accenture, what we learned with our investor research work since then, because the Accenture report came out in the spring, and how we've begun to respond. Clearly, the introduction of new technologies has changed and is continuing to change the ways in which advice is offered and consumed. Technology enables clients to self-serve or control more of their interactions. I think it's also fair to say that the general body of investors are more confident and more digitally aware than ever before. So at least in many segments of the industry, digital tools are now expected by investors, even demanded. And they don't serve as a differentiator between firms' offerings the way they did in some of the early days of their introduction. The second thing we learned with Accenture is that we are seeing, as you do, a shift towards goals-oriented investment and a movement towards human-centric approaches to advice. Put it in simpler terms, that means something that you already know, that investors do not view their money or their goals from the perspective of an account. They're looking to broader wealth management advice and services to support their overall financial objectives. Third, investors are demanding more transparency and more control in their wealth management process, and the ability to move between different levels of service when their circumstances demand it. Now, all of these trends are signaling a demand for more advice and more comprehensive advice, and that's clearly a good thing for the industry. So what might this mean to us? To answer that, let's contrast what service models and consumer expectations are like today versus those we see on the horizon. Let me also try to link that to how regulation might need to change to accommodate those expectations. Because in some cases, the changes to regulation are pretty substantial. In the simplest terms, In many channels, investors are today told what advice they're going to get based on how much money they have. Often the advice they receive is account-oriented, or asset-oriented, or even product-oriented. But in the future, we see a demand from clients to increasingly consume advice on their own terms. To give you the soundbite, they want good advice for a fair price, when they need it, only on the question they want answered then, and delivered how they want to consume it. What does it mean? I don't know if you noticed, but in the last couple of paragraphs, I switched from the word investor, which is quite popular in regulator speak, to the word client, which to me is a much more personal term. So who is the client? Historically, at least from the point of view of securities regulation, client meant one or two accounts belonging to one person, a person advised by one advisor. Today, is that really true anymore? Is the client one person or is it a couple? Is it a group of adults and children who have fully shared goals, or goals that only partially overlap? If you asked your clients to define themselves, how many would include 2 or 3 generations in the group of people that they're talking about? Of course, not everyone needs that degree of flexibility, but many do, and in some surprising ways. Let me demonstrate with a couple of examples. So I mentioned a couple times already that we just received some results from our latest investor research initiative. It was conducted by a public opinion research firm called the Strategic Council, which you may know from the political world. And it looked at how Canadians want to access advice. It'll be published later this month. But it was just too relevant to the kinds of business that you all do and to the discussions that we're having here today to ignore. I will say that while I wasn't terribly surprised by the direction of the answers, I was quite surprised by their strength. As an example, in our survey, 86% of Canadians want to be able to access a range of financial products without going to different providers, or even without needing to open additional accounts. 90% of the sample wanted the level of financial advice and service, presumably within that one account they just indicated they wanted, to flex up and down to meet the changes in their needs and circumstances. And they want that advice to be personalized to their specific goals and needs. Within that flexibility to choose the level of advice and services that they want, they also want the choice in how to pay for it. Almost 80% of current investors and 60% of aspiring investors, because we talk to people who are in the advice world now and those who would just like to be, they say it's important for payment options for accessing advice to be flexible. Well, by the way, of current investors, less than 1/3 are very satisfied with the way they pay for advice today. Of those who aren't satisfied, only 12% want to pay fees as a percentage of assets, while 40% want a pay-as-you-go model. Now, if those results are truly representative of Canadians' wants and needs, and this is just a survey, so you got to keep that in mind, but if that does represent Canadians' views, I'd say that many segments of the financial services industry has a ways to go to meet them. And at the same time, for that matter, some of the concepts that underlie our regulatory model, particularly our supervisory expectations, also need to be pretty thoroughly rethought. Simultaneously, so do the business processes and the technology that support advisors and their firms, all the way from customer-facing services on the one end to those that support supervision and reporting on the other. And yes, regulators' technology needs to be completely overhauled as well. Now, it may sound as if I'm spending a lot of time talking about technology when I'm supposed to be talking about advice. But I do believe that technology will enable us to help deliver Canadians the advice that they want at a price they're willing and able to pay, and within a regulatory structure that maintains the protections that they deserve. We talked to a lot of different organizations as we were doing this work with Accenture, from one end of the country to the other. IROC dealers, yes, but also mutual fund dealers, portfolio managers, and a variety of organizations from outside of North America as well. And it's true that most of the organizations we spoke to already aspire to delivering the holistic, personalized, and relationship-based offering that the research I just quoted to you says Canadians want. But without further technological innovation by the industry, and just as important, further facilitation of technology by regulators, it's hard to see how all that can be done at a price that a large swath of Canadians are willing and able to pay. So that brings me to an important but sometimes sensitive question: the cost of the device and the relationship to access and the role of regulation. As I've already talked about, the demand for financial advice amongst Canadians is rising every day. And that's hardly surprising. We as individuals and as families are much more personally responsible for retirement planning than we were in a world of long-term stable employment and defined benefit pension plans. But in today's world, personalized advice, including human touch points, is expensive. However, in the same research that I just talked about, over 70% of current investors and 60% of aspiring investors wanted that advice to come from a human. The importance to Canadians of human contact in the provision of advice is no surprise to you. Indeed, it's one of your greatest strategic advantages as independent financial brokers. Clearly, as people become more comfortable with electronically delivered services of all kinds, those numbers will change. But it may take a while, because people, maybe especially Canadians, are naturally skeptical. Here's one example of that skepticism. Consider that almost 1/3 of current investors and almost half of aspiring investors think that online advice models have less regulatory protection than traditional models. The rules are the same, regardless of how the advice is delivered. So to make the math work of giving people advice that they need the way that they want it, we have to get better at integrating solutions that feature both people and technology. We have to get better about using technology to free up more time for you to spend with your clients, freeing up your time and your clients' time as well. And that's true not only for the service delivery side, but on the regulatory side as well. When we talked to the industry, we heard that Canada's regulatory regime is hampering innovation by increasing complexity, duplication, and cost, and slowing the pace of innovation, which constrains access to advice and services, especially to mass market and underserved investors. So we need to make it easier for firms and for regulators themselves to carry out their oversight, their compliance, and supervisory functions by using technology. Okay, that's easier said than done. We are a long way from the ideal, which I would analogize as the equivalent of apples, it just works. But it's important that we work towards that goal. That's because access to advice matters. For the reasons that I've already identified, Canadians need it. So that may seem like a funny thing for me, a regulator, to say to you. Many assume that as a regulator, we're more focused on investor protection. Indeed, our mission statement as IROC is protecting investors and supporting healthy Canadian capital markets. But here's the thing. To me, access to advice is an investor protection issue. If we don't give Canadians access to advice, their long-term financial futures will suffer as a result. So when we take steps to help the industry transform itself, when that transformation gives Canadians better access to solid, personalized, and fairly priced advice, with all of the traditional investor protections intact, we help Canadians build financial stability. And that, to me, is definitely consistent with the mission statement I just read out to you. So I've spent a long time talking about what we've learned about what Canadians have told us, what they want and what they need, and how important it is that Canadians have access to advice in the world that we live in today. And finally, what we've learned about how the industry is starting to transform itself to try and give Canadians what they should have. But other than general statements about how we, regulators, need to facilitate the use of technology in service delivery and in